Have you ever wondered what the real story is behind Pope Pius XII, the Vatican, Nazism, and the Holocaust? Well, stick around because today we've got shocking new details on the man, the myths, and the legend right here on CIA. It seems like some people, organizations, and governments are hell-bent on bringing down the Catholic Church. The question is, how do you expose opposition to the faith and to the truth? And while they say what you don't know can't hurt you, everybody needs to know about the hidden forces prowling around the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Guess that's where we come in. Follow me. Hello and welcome to another edition of Catholic Investigative Agency, CIA. I'm Michael Vorse. Yes, I'm sure you've all heard the talk around the old water cooler. Pius XII didn't speak out against the Nazis. Pius XII did nothing to help the Jews during the Holocaust. Or maybe, from the more deluded of your co-worker pontificators, the notion that Pius XII somehow supported Hitler and the Nazis. Well, as you might have guessed, the pop culture perception of Pius XII is nothing more than the mere fabrication of cultural and media myths. In an effort to address those myths, today's topic is Pope Pius XII and the Jews, debunking the lie that while Hitler and his Nazi regime were systematically and ruthlessly exterminating Jews across Europe, Pope Pius XII, and by extension the Catholic Church, stood idly by, or worse, were complicit in the atrocities. As always, we begin our show with a thesis statement, and that statement is, contrary to commonly held belief, Pius XII fought stridently to save the Jews of Europe from the gas chambers of Nazi Germany. Moreover, his courageous efforts were universally recognized until the mid-1960s, until liberal Catholics began to spread lies about his actions. Now, we're going to give you the ammo you need to combat those who despise the Church. Today's program will arm you with valuable facts that will allow you to competently refute the liars and ideologues who claim that Pius XII did nothing to help the Jews, to clarify the Pope's alleged silence during the Holocaust, and to explain where all these false accusations against Pius XII originated. If you're not familiar with the topic, let's take a moment to fill out this myth a little more. There are two common perceptions about Pius XII's behavior during World War II. The first is that at best, Pius XII was both silent and inactive in the face of the Nazi terror, that he did nothing to oppose Hitler, never publicly condemning him or his ideology, and never excommunicating members of the Nazi Party. The second is that, at worst, Pius XII collaborated with the Nazis, and so, not only passively, but actively had a hand in the terrible genocide. These allegations against Pius XII are patently false. Let me say that again. The accusations that purport Pius XII was in any way less than courageous in his defense of the Jews during the Holocaust is absolutely absurd and a grave injustice. Pius XII and the Catholic Church did all they could to help the Jews and even endured their own persecutions at the hands of the Nazis as a result. Remember that in addition to the 6 million Jews who were murdered by Hitler and the Nazis, countless others who were non-Jews were also murdered, many of whom were Catholic clergy and Catholic resistors. Now that you know the unadulterated truth, we begin to build an argument in support of it, and an argument whose strength is drawn from viable historical facts. We will follow the life of Pius XII chronologically, beginning with his opposition to the Nazi Party as papal nuncio to Germany, up through the beginning of his reign as Pope in 1939, when, coinciding with the outbreak of World War II, he then waged a covert war against the Third Reich. We shall begin then with the early years against Nazism. As papal nuncio to Germany, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli established himself as an outspoken critic of Nazi ideology years before Hitler declared himself Führer. And in fact, as nuncio between 1917 and 1929, and on German soil, he, the future Pope Pius XII, delivered over 40 speeches attacking Nazism and criticizing Hitler's doctrines. Pacelli's outspoken opposition to Nazism did not end when he became the Vatican Secretary of State in 1930. In this highly influential capacity, he continued to publicly denounce the Hitlerian ideology across Europe. For example, on April 28, 1935, more than 4 full years before the war began, Pacelli, speaking to a crowd of over 250,000 pilgrims in Lourdes, France, publicly criticized the ideology of Hitler and the Nazi Party. He said that the Nazis, quote,
"They are in reality only miserable plagiarists who dress up old errors with new tinsel. It does not make any difference whether they flock to the banners of social revolution, whether they are guided by a false concept of the world and of life, or whether they are possessed by the superstition of a race and blood cult."
Further proof of his abhorrence to Nazism is the fact that Pacelli never once met Hitler. So great was his aversion to Nazi ideology. In fact, speeches and other such bold public acts, in addition to countless private notes sent to Berlin, earned Pacelli, as Vatican Secretary of State, a reputation as a strident enemy of the Nazis among the top brass of the Nazis themselves. But Pacelli's opposition to the Nazis did not end when he became Pope. In fact, his opposition became even more pronounced. So let's take a look at some things Pope Pius XII did in the early stages of his pontificate, actions which concretized his position as an enemy of Hitler. Recalling Pacelli's reputation as Secretary of State, it may come as no surprise to learn that the Germans were vociferous in speaking out against the possibility that Pacelli might succeed Pope Pius XI. Indeed, when Pacelli ascended to the throne of St. Peter in March of 1939, the announcement was met by the Berlin Morgenpost with the following quote:
"The election of Cardinal Pacelli is not accepted with favor in Germany because he was always opposed to Nazism and practically determined the policies of the Vatican under his predecessor."
On September 1st, 1939, not even 6 months into his pontificate, Hitler invaded Poland and war descended on Europe. Yet Pope Pius XII remained unwavering in his disgust toward Nazism, even as the very real threat of Nazi conquest confronted him. One incident in particular displays the absolute steadfastness with which he opposed the Nazi regime, even as that great force of evil breathed down his neck. In early 1940, Hitler attempted to co-opt the Pope. On March 11, 1940, he sent Joachim von Ribbentrop, his Secretary of State, to dissuade Pius XII from maintaining his anti-Nazi stance. Von Ribbentrop made a lengthy presentation privately to Pope Pius on the invincibility of the Third Reich, the inevitability of Nazi takeover, and the foolishness of siding with the enemies of Der Führer. Throughout the harangue, the Pope listened silently and unemotionally. But when von Ribbentrop had finished his thinly veiled threat, Pius XII calmly opened a ledger on his desk and began reciting, in perfect German, a list of atrocities committed by the Third Reich in Poland, giving precise details of each crime. Upon completing the list, Pius XII waited for von Ribbentrop's response. But a response never came, and the audience was terminated. Pope Pius XII, staring into the eyes of the beast itself, remained resolute in his opposition towards Hitler and set up himself and the Church henceforth as enemies of the Führer and allies to the Jews. These facts prove that in the years leading up to the war and even during the early stages of the war itself, Pius XII was a strong and oftentimes vocal Nazi detractor and Jewish supporter. However, even after bringing these facts to the table, you may still meet with some opposition that will come from Pius XII's apparent silence during the Holocaust. So, let's address this silence. As you might have heard, the main accusation against Pius XII is that during the Holocaust itself, he remained silent and inactive. Only the more extremely delusional critics say that he actively supported the Nazi extermination of the Jews. Bear in mind that both of these claims are false. But while the second claim is utter nonsense, the first claim deserves a lot of attention because those wishing to defame Pius XII often cite it, and you need to know how to combat it. How come Pius XII didn't publicly denounce the Nazis by name or systematically excommunicate Catholic Nazis? If there is any truth to the claim that Pius XII and the Vatican were silent, it was not out of cowardice or moral indifference. It was because the Vatican was engaged in a subversive clandestine war against the Nazis, a war successfully saving countless thousands of Jews across Europe. A slew of contemporary documents have come to light in the past handful of years, establishing the efforts of Pius to secretly work to save the Jews. So the accusation that Pius XII was both silent and inactive is wholly inaccurate and flies in the face of all the facts of history. The Pope was muted, but it was so that he could maximize the effectiveness of his actions, and we will discuss those actions shortly. But first, it's necessary to show why it was in the best interest of both Jewish and Catholic Europeans alike for Pius XII to be somewhat muted in public condemnations of Nazism after the war began. Recall the situation in Europe during the days of Nazi occupation. Most lands, almost all of Europe, was under total Nazi control, and those areas that were not occupied perpetually faced the imminent threat of occupation, including the Vatican City-State itself. Jews and Catholics were obviously dispersed throughout all of the occupied and unoccupied lands of Europe, and so the threat of Nazi brutality was always present. Indeed, Pius XII knew that any outright public attack against the Nazis would incite the full wrath of Hitler on Catholics in occupied territories. So then, the best thing that he could do for Catholics in Europe was to be publicly silent. And by the very same token, this was also the best thing he could do for the Jews as well. This is because if Catholics began to be targeted, they would no longer be able to provide any assistance to the Jews. The need to avoid making inflammatory statements against the Nazis in such a delicate situation was recognized in most Jewish circles at the time, according to noted Jewish historian Rabbi Pincus Lapide. About this, Lapide also says,
"It was in fact the basic rule of all those agencies in wartime Europe who keenly felt the duty to do all that was possible for the victims of Nazi atrocities, and in particular for the Jews in proximate danger of deportation to an unknown destination."
One incident in particular demonstrated to Pius the potential negative consequences of speaking out against the Nazis. Johann de Jong, the Archbishop of Utrecht in Holland, after being warned by the Nazis not to protest the deportation of Dutch Jews, chose to speak out against the injustice anyway. The Nazi retaliation was swift and terrible. They rounded up the entire population of Jewish converts to Catholicism in Holland and sent them to their deaths. Among those Catholic Jews executed in the retaliation was Carmelite philosopher and religious sister Edith Stein. Essentially, Pius XII had two options: remain quiet publicly, but be able to actively and covertly save Jews with the full power and organization of the Catholic Church, or he could have mugged for the cameras and publicly denounced Hitler and the Nazis, and thus brought about the persecution of Catholics, and as a result, ended his ability to help the Jews. So the Pope chose to remain relatively quiet in order to undertake clandestine efforts to save the Jews and undermine the Nazis. Yet Pius was not totally silent during the war. When Jews first began to be arrested in Italy, he did speak out in defense of them in the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano. Let us offer some specific examples of the work the Pope did, often at great risk, at the service of the persecuted Jews during the Holocaust. Oftentimes, actions are much more important than words. Pius XII sacrificed words for the liberty to actively work to save Jewish lives, and act he did. To cite renowned Jewish diplomat and historian Rabbi Pincus Lapide again, he estimates that between 700 to 860,000 Jewish lives were saved by the efforts of Pius XII during the Holocaust. Let's take a look at some specific examples of such efforts. While the United States, Great Britain, and many other countries refused Jewish refugees during the war, the Vatican, at the direction of Pius XII, issued thousands of fake documents to Jews across Europe. These documents allowed Jews to travel secretly as Christians so that they could escape Nazi deportation. In addition to these invaluable travel documents, Pius XII provided much-needed financial support to the Jews. Jewish historians say the financial aid provided by Pius XII numbered into the millions of dollars in the 1940s, dollars even much more valuable today. However, it was Pius XII's service to the Jews of Rome that are most tangible, best able to refute that water cooler myth. Rabbi Lapide notes that at least 155 convents and monasteries belonging to the Vatican provided secret shelter to 5,000 Jews in Rome throughout the duration of the German occupation. 3,000 more Jews were safely hidden at the Pope's summer residence, Castel Gandolfo. Another 60 found refuge for 9 months at the Gregorian University, right in the heart of Rome. 6 even had a safe place to sleep in the cellar of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. These are just a handful of examples, and the list goes on and on. Note that Pius provided safe haven to Jews not only on church property, but also in the Vatican itself, even in his own summer home. Again, recall that Rabbi Lapide estimates that at least 700,000 Jews were saved by the efforts of Pius XII and the Vatican during the Holocaust. He estimates that this total is higher than the efforts of every other Jewish relief organization combined. So one shocking fact you may choose to share with your coworkers next time they bash Pius would be to point out that the Catholic Church, at the direction of Pope Pius XII, was the single most successful relief organization in saving Jewish lives, dwarfing all others. In fact, Pius XII's efforts on behalf of the Jews was so great that during the war on February 28, 1944, Rabbi Yitzhak Herzog, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem at the time, had this to say as Europe yearned for the war to come to an end.
The people of Israel will never forget what His Holiness and his illustrious delegates, inspired by the eternal principles of religion which form the very foundations of true civilization, are doing for us unfortunate brothers and sisters in the most tragic hour of our history.
Praise for Pius XII from the Jewish community did not end with the defeat of the Nazis. As more information came out in the years immediately following the war, Pius XII was universally recognized by both Jews and non-Jews for the courageous work he did at the service of the Jewish people, as well as for his efforts to subvert Nazi forces. Here are some examples of the praise given to Pius XII by the Jewish community. Listen carefully to Moshe Sharet, who would later become Israel's first foreign minister and second prime minister, and also the words of praise from Rabbi Herzog, the first chief rabbi of Israel, along with Albert Einstein and even Golda Meir, a future prime minister of Israel, upon the Holy Father's death in 1958.
I told Pius XII that my first duty was to thank him, and through him the Catholic Church, on behalf of the Jewish public, for all they had done in various countries to rescue Jews. We are deeply grateful to the Catholic Church.
His life-saving efforts on behalf of the Jews during the occupation of Italy.
Only the Catholic Church protested against the Hitlerian onslaught on liberty. Today, I feel a great admiration for the Church, which alone has had the courage to struggle for spiritual truth and moral liberty.
We share the grief of the world over the death of His Holiness Pius XII. During the 10 years of Nazi terror, when our people passed through the horrors of martyrdom, the Pope raised his voice to condemn the persecutors and to commiserate with their victims.
Yet Israel Zoli, the chief rabbi of Rome during the Nazi occupation, gave perhaps the greatest single testimony to Pius XII's virtue. In 1945, after having been an eyewitness to the actions of Pius XII for the Jewish people, Israel Zoli converted to Catholicism and even took Eugenio as his baptismal name, the given name of Pope Pius XII. The question then becomes clear. How did the public perception of Pius XII change so drastically that he went from hero to villain, and who was responsible for spreading the lies about him? The appalling notion that Pius XII did nothing to help the Jews didn't begin until 2 full decades after World War II ended. Lies about Pius XII began to be propagated by liberal-leaning Catholics who, swept up in the spirit of Vatican II, began a libelous smear campaign against the Church in order to undermine its authority. And what better way to discredit the Church than to suggest it was complicit in one of the most heinous crimes humanity has ever seen, and that the Pope personally was aligned with Hitler and the Nazis. The first instance of publicly questioning the Pope's valor during the war came in the play The Deputy, written by German author and militant anti-Catholic Rolf Hochhuth. The play debuted in 1963 and depicted the Pope as a weak, cowardly man too petrified by fear to speak out against the Nazis and their crimes against the Jews. The fact of the matter is that The Deputy was not widely seen, and so surely it in itself is not to blame for changing the public perception of Pius XII. But as it turns out, timing was everything, and in this case, The Deputy debuted at exactly the right time to provide the impetus for a smear campaign to be launched against the memory of Pius XII. In 1963, when the play debuted, the Church was in the heat of Vatican II, and many, both clergy and laity, were calling for massive social change. It was the beginning of the permissive age, and modernists and progressives within the Church realized that traditional Catholic orthodoxy was the major obstacle to the social and sexual change that they so desperately desired. They knew that they had to undermine the Church, for if you undermine the Church, you can validate revolutionizing it as you see fit. So the liberals within the Church seized on the fiction of the play and began to transform that fiction into their own historical fairy tale. Their story found favor with a Western culture that was likewise in the mood for social change, and it began to spread throughout the world like wildfire, with the first generation passing the lie on to their children, and so on. And such is the state we find ourselves in today, where it is simply taken for granted that this pop culture society, that Pius XII was an anti-Semite who stood by silently as the Jewish race was systematically exterminated. Even down to our own contemporary time, whenever the case is mentioned for the canonization of Pope Pius XII, an uproar from liberal Jews and the mainstream media erupts every time. The myth of so-called Hitler's Pope, to borrow the phrase of a libelous and slanderous book, is perpetrated over and over again. Various international bodies feel the greatest compunction to denounce Vatican efforts to advance the cause of Pope Pius XII. They immediately appear in the media attacking any such efforts and using the occasion to viciously malign the Church. As Catholics, however, we are duty-bound to defend the faith, as well as to defend the visible body of Christ on earth, Holy Mother Church, and her earthly visible head, the Pope. Fortunately for those wishing to defend the honor of Pius XII and the Church, there remains recourse to the facts, and the facts are not in favor of those water cooler myths. Indeed, the facts we have shown you today prove that Pius XII was nothing less than splendidly courageous in his non-stop efforts to save the Jews, and also in his absolutely uncompromising opposition to Nazism. Use these facts to defend the faith, to defend a great man and Pope Pius XII. You see, the problem with lies and myths is that they are, by definition, not based on the truth of reality, and so they shatter when confronted with the truth. So now you know. Thanks for watching this edition of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Voris. Let's hit the streets.